All right. Well, the media wants you to be stupid and weak and a whiny little baby. I can think of another B word, a whiny brat. If you are those things, you are a perfect audience for them. You will keep clicking and you will keep tuning in for them to tell you that your feelings are hurt and you are a victim and you are unsafe. And they do not want you to be mentally equipped to be resilient or think critically. This I was more convinced of than ever before today as I listened to the first 2 episodes of a new podcast called The Witch Trials of JK Rowling. And then I looked at the coverage of this podcast and saw just how extremely false it was, how full of lies, and how bent it was towards their narrative that will keep you in this sort of place of dichotomous thinking. I almost couldn't believe it. I was sitting with my kids and I just kept yelling out loud, and they had no context for this because they're not following this sort of witch hunts of JK Rowling. They just know Harry Potter. But take a look at this CNN article today. What to know about this new podcast and history of harmful anti-trans comments from JK Rowling. They just sort of boil it down. Like, if you listen to this, you are already just hopping into her hot steaming pile of anti-trans rhetoric. And that's all you need to know, even though nothing in the podcast was about transgender in the first 2 episodes. Here's Salon saying, JK Rowling dismisses her transphobic legacy, saying, I'll be dead. False. That's not what she says at all. What she says is, I'm willing to say controversial things that lead people to critical thought because I am not worried about my legacy, because whatever people think of me when I'm dead, I'm dead. I'm worried about living my life now and saying things that are important now. But those are just lazy and reductive stories. It's clear to me that neither writer listened to the podcast. They're also just full of lies about trans rights and single-sex spaces. Were you going to say something that I cut you off?
No, I was just thinking how sad it is. What type of person would be the type of person that subscribes to like CNN Entertainment's feed, like to get their perspective on these stories, and to see these types of headlines is just so incredible. And I see this constantly from CNN on these stories, these sort of fake headlines and these articles that aren't reflexive of what actually happened in the podcast, in the movie, in the series, anything.
Or what her actual point is about critical thinking. I think she says some brilliant things. I want to point them out in a minute. But also, I mean, I absolutely at one point would have maybe seen something like this on CNN's homepage and thought, oh yeah, JK Rowling, I love Potter. I'm going to see what people say about her. And then, oh, she's transphobic, and I might have like got myself worked up around the rhetoric because I wanted to be on the right side of human rights. Sure. Until I decided to read things that challenged my viewpoint about transgender rights, which I've spoken about at length. For instance, one of the things that they say here in CNN is that detransitioning is extremely rare. That's a lie. In fact, new data from a new documentary called, what's it called? David, what's it called? We watched it this weekend.
Affirming
Generation.
Something.
Yes.
There you go.
They talk about how actually detransitioners have a rate of about 60% of people who try to change their bodies into the opposite biological sex, and it hurts. It's painful to do that. The hormones are changing you. They are causing all kinds of contraindications. These surgeries hurt. When you remove your hysterectomy at 16, that's painful. And people stop not because they're discriminated against, but because these medications have contraindications in long-term health. And CNN says it's rare. They have no data to suggest that. It's not true.
They also stated specifically in that documentary that the numbers are most likely much higher because a lot of people are going to be embarrassed to come forward after doing that because it kind of like, negates everything they had been saying to their families and all that other stuff.
Good point. I had forgotten about that. And they don't work with their same doctors because it seems like the doctors that put them on these medications don't have any way to support them coming off of it because there's no real data on how to do that. Like, oh, we were all in on giving you T, what they call testosterone. We don't know how to support you coming off of that. And so they just sort of stop taking it and then see what happens. And they feel totally lost by the medical community who can't help fix it.
It's like, the same people that build the boat aren't the same people that take it apart and decommission the boat.
Right.
Totally different buildings, totally different people.
Yeah. Okay, they have other things about like this threat of violence and suicide and around gender dysphoria that CNN just sort of drags out as tropes, which are absolutely not true. But I don't want to keep making these points again because you can rewind the tape to other episodes. But the first 2 episodes of this podcast with JK Rowling is not at all about transgender rights. It's about the dangers of witch burning anything or anyone. Now, when we talk about witch burning, it's a saying, is like you rile yourself up around persecuting somebody for an idea, right? And normally when we say that, they're witch burning that person, we say it now as if the witch no longer deserves to be burned, right? When we use this, like, oh, that's a witch hunt. And when you use that, you're like, that person shouldn't be persecuted in that way.
Right. We look back at the Salem witch trials as a awful, stain on our history, right?
Yeah.
I can't believe that we did that to these people, right?
Yeah. And that was largely around some wealthy daughters of wealthy families who got sick and were dying and they couldn't explain it. And they said, oh, there must be some malfeasance in this area. Let's go. And they started to like find people. And it comes, usually there's, I'm going to get to this in a second, but there are certain threads that run through witch hunts that are common. And a lot of times they come off of something that's so tiny, but there's a certain type of population that can spark a match towards a witch hunt. And CNN wants that right now to create this kindling.
Well, kindling turns into a fire, but CNN's ratings are so atrocious.
Right.
Like, of course, they'll try anything right now. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I got 2 points. One, it's literally like the Monty Python bit on the witch. I mean, that's how people are now. It's like, well, she's got a big nose. So, or
she's
a
a witch.
nose, so she must be a witch.
Yeah.
Burn her.
But the other point is, I believe CNN and these news companies know that people aren't going to actually go out and do any research on their own. Because I see TikTok people saying, she's transphobic and all this other stuff. Yet you ask them to quote what she said. Well, I don't listen to what she says. I've never listened to her. Like they don't get any of the information on their own. So they're able to get that narrative out there knowing that these people aren't going to look into anything.
Okay. So here's the beautiful irony about this is that the host of this podcast is a former Christian fundamentalist who once was also against Potter books. And she draws a parallel between how in the early 90s and the early 2000s, it was Christian fundamentalists who were trying to witch hunt JK Rowling. And without having read the books. And now she talks to people who were lawyers, who were like the very first people to take to court whether or not schools should have Harry Potter books in their libraries. And interestingly enough, the people on the right who fought to ban her books are now kind of further along in their human journey and regret doing that. Listen to a lawyer. This is the guy who took her books to court so that the library would not have them available to children and lost. And listen to how he feels about that now.
That in talking to David, I learned that he had completely changed his mind about this case that he'd argued so strongly long ago.
If Christians get all caught up in banning books that we think are dangerous for our kids, then we're legally opening the door to non-Christians banning books for their kids that we think are good for their kids.
Okay, so it is the fundamental right that has learned their lesson and said, oh, that's a little dangerous to cancel things. We tried that. This same lawyer had not read the books when he took this to trial and he lost. And now he later in the podcast asked the host to thank JK Rowling for the joy that those books are. He says they are a little dark, but they are actually fantastic. I love them. Tell her I thank her for them, because he actually then, after he fought this crusade, after he witch hunted her, read the books, and decades later feels differently. I think here the parallel that this host is trying to make is that Christians took issue with this book because of black and white thinking and refused to actually argue the point. And now we have transgender people in their new transgender rights activists who want to burn her books, who want to change the name of Quidditch to quad ball, which is really just Muggle Quidditch, promote bans to Hogwarts Legacy video game, which CNN begrudgingly points out is a bestseller in less than a week. And listen to how she sort of draws this argument. This is JK Rowling speaking now, talking about how people who do this, who want to ban something, who are book burners, just... it's like it's a trump card because they can't argue the point. Listen to her.
Many of the people involved in those movements understood themselves to be on the side of righteousness, believed they were doing the right thing, felt themselves justified in what they were doing. I suppose for me, book burners by definition, predictably, to me have placed themselves across a line of rational debate. I'm simply going to destroy the idea that I don't like. I will destroy the idea. I can't destroy it, so I will destroy its representation. I will burn this book. There is no book on this planet that I would burn. No book, including books that I do think are damaging. Mm-hmm. Burning, to me, is the last resort of people who cannot argue.
Okay.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
People who burn books can't argue. Think about that. That's such a great line.
Right. I mean, I literally, we were traveling today and I was just choking up at the idea of this. One, because Harry Potter is very personal to me. It's something I share with my children. And because of this woman who is willing to be burned for what she thinks is protection of safe spaces and says so articulately. Now, here is where she says that this is an indication of closed-mindedness. And I listened to this three times. I won't make you do 3 times because I think it's so poignant. Listen.
There's a huge appeal, and I tried to show this in the Potter books, to black and white thinking. It's the easiest place to be, and in many ways is the safest place to be. If you take an all-or-nothing position on anything, you will definitely find comrades. You will easily find a community. I've sworn allegiance to this one simple idea. What I tried to show in the Potter books, and what I feel very strongly myself, we should mistrust ourselves most when we are certain. And we should question ourselves most when we receive a rush of adrenaline by doing or saying something. Many people mistake that rush of adrenaline for the voice of conscience. I've got a rush from saying that, I'm right. Mm-hmm. In my worldview, conscience speaks in a very small and inconvenient voice, and it's normally saying to you, think again, look more deeply, consider this.
Okay.
Someone points out that Hitler burned books. Yeah, if you're in the same camp as Hitler, you want to burn books. Also, Berserk says in our chat, when the debate is lost, slander becomes the tool of the loser. I love that.
Okay. I'm going to have to think about that.
It's good. It's good.
All right.
It means if you can't argue with someone, if you don't have the intelligence to argue, then you burn things. Or not
even necessarily argue, but discuss viewpoints.
Right.
And I think what she's saying here is that if you've gotten yourself so worked up about something that you are now part of what this great book that I just read last week, The Coddling of the American Mind, Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt, they call this the call-out culture. When someone is calling out offenses for social status. Now think about that. Like you're in a crowded place and you post a video for calling out somebody for being a racist, and that increases your social score. In a classroom, when you say, oh, that's patriarchal or you're cisgendered or whatever, then you get social status boosted because it signals to the world, I am not a racist. I am woke. I can call that out. I get a rush of adrenaline. That makes me right. If you take up a grievance privately with somebody, you get no social points and you'd be seen as fraternizing with the enemy. And so instead, you're calling it out because you're so right. And so what she's saying here is that, you know, if you are part of that call out culture, you have closed yourself off to some type of thinking, to critical thinking. And you're saying, this is my conscience trying to make the world better, but while lifting myself up through the call out culture. And I think what she's saying is we need to sort of think more slowly, think more rationally, and be able to have conversations with other people critically. You know, what the podcast is about is that JK Rowling is a domestic and sexual abuse survivor. She has also suffered depression, and she wrote most of this fantastic series while she was in the darkest times of her life. So this is a story about succeeding while you're getting tarred and feathered, about resilience, about actually being someone who knows something about being a female survivor of domestic abuse and male violence. But the media doesn't want you to hear this story. They want you to reduce her to a transphobe, to someone who's hateful.
Well, that's it. Like, if you know her story, like this should be the woman that all of these people put on a pedestal. Talk about creating a world of diversity and not judging anybody for what or who they are, other than Voldemort. But you know, like. She has created a diverse world, and she's very open-minded. She said that Dumbledore was gay like years and years and years ago. Like, she's very open and honest with that stuff. And I just like, this is like an ally to everyone, not an enemy. And I just can't see why they do this with no proof or evidence whatsoever.
Right.
Well, we are given an opportunity to offer empathy for Voldemort. Even Voldemort gets a backstory.
That's true.
And
that's true.
Like, we get to see how his choices led him one way or another, and we're invited in to feel sorry for him. So we can,
the choices that lead him to a dark path.
Yes.
Right. Lead him to evil. Right.
Now, in the coddling book, though, the authors point out that witch hunts are usually sparked from some minor slight, which is true in this case. Like, she liked a tweet that people thought was hateful, and then she spoke out for another woman for saying that single-sex spaces were important. But there's another thing that this has in common, all witch hunts, is that people are afraid to speak up for the witch, because they know this is irrational, but they're afraid to get caught up in the mob and get burned themselves. So they let other people burn. And so I see these CNN pieces, salon pieces, as witch hunters, even though I think there must be more critical minds behind these stories. Even, you know, so she is just not willing to let things like this happen. Like, here's a Redux story from Canada. This weekend, mother threatened with arrest after confronting male watching girls undress in changing rooms at this swimming pool. The woman there was a chat group, a mother's chat group saying, there's a person, a male, that's been in this pool for several weeks now. Watch out for him. She saw him, and she watched him go in, like just take his shoes on and off, and then walk into the bathroom stall next to her daughter and peek underneath. And she said, I think you should get out of here. And he said, I don't have to, because I'm a female identifier and this is my right. And now the pool is saying, well, you could get arrested for saying that he can't be in there while he's literally peeking under. So this is JK Rowling's point, is that there is a need for single-sex spaces. We can have third spaces for people with gender dysphoria without actually impinging on women's rights. Here's another This Week in Transgender News, a tweet from Abigail Schreier, author of Irreparable Damage. Why was this woman face being allowed to dominate headlines?
Well, let's read the headline for people that are driving and can't hear it.
Okay.
So it says, New York Post headline says, Arkansas woman arrested for making bomb threat against Mississippi college town.
And she says, one day newsrooms will wake up and be astonished that they ever published headlines like this. Like,
I have to think the New York Post is doing this tongue in cheek. Like, they're, New York Post headlines are classic, right?
Yeah.
They're just playing this one straight. No pun intended. They're literally, and if you see the photo, if you're driving, you can't watch us. You're listening to the audio version of the show. It's a dude with a beard. Like, it's a dude, right? And the headline reads, Arkansas woman arrested for, because this guy identifies as a woman.
I guess, again, I refer you to the piece we did on woman face, and I ask you, how am I as a woman supposed to feel about that? Now the courts in Canada will start to hear cases such as this woman who is suing her doctors for giving her medically unnecessary breast removal surgery and hysterectomy as a teenager. Watch.
Each step involved irreversible alterations to my body and came with serious risks. Yet all were met with little challenge despite my long-standing history of mental health struggles and no indication of gender-related distress in childhood or adolescence. I am alleging that this lack of inquiry is a failure of due diligence amounting to medical negligence towards a vulnerable patient.
Okay. To my mind, she should not have to sue. There should have been adults to protect her from this in the first place. Hysterectomies with no medically necessary. I mean, there's all kinds of things that happen to a body when you remove the uterus. Okay. Incidentally, though, we're bringing this back full circle. The lawyer who fought to ban Potter books lost his case because the courts decided that even a minor child has a right to freedom of information. So the courts in this case protected children's access to literature. So will the courts again side with Rowling and protect children from medical experimentation? Or will they side with women and protect them for single-sex spaces? Even if they do, the media will still tell you that she's a transphobe, so you keep clicking.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. There's so many different viewpoints on this, but most people are saying like it's absolutely based what JK Rowling had said, and we should all listen to that podcast.
Yeah, I do recommend the podcast. I am a little jealous about the access. I would have loved to have hosted a podcast because she so rarely speaks, and I
never too late.
Yeah, maybe I'll do the sequel. And I'm also just struck that she is so able to make her point so clearly and also lets us into a little bit of her life that we don't normally get. It's really well done. And I think that it is an important story of actually standing your ground that they just don't want you to hear. They don't want you to hear stories of emotional resilience because that makes you a better consumer of news. We do. And so that's why we're bringing this to you.
Yeah, and we don't
I don't know if you know, but there's actually a movie, an old movie about JK Rowling. And that's where I learned about her having to pen her name as JK so they didn't know it was a woman. Like, it's a really good little movie. And then there's an interview that she did with Daniel Radcliffe where she kind of goes over a lot of these points again and talks about Dumbledore and the decisions she made and the diversity in the show. And that's a really good, it's probably like an hour and a half long, but it's really good. I mean, I was like emotional the whole time. It was just really good. Like, she's just such a good person.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think she sort of cautions about like good and bad people, like using those kind of black and white terms. Everybody, all humans are complicated. Even our like Hierophant is, in Dumbledore is flawed.
Yeah.
And so, I think I sort of leave room for her to be a flawed human being, but also like stand her ground on behalf of the rest of us so that so that we don't all have to be witch hunted.
Thank you so much for watching this segment here at Redacted. We are live every day at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, trying to share the stories that the mainstream media will not cover. You should also come over and join our community of Redacted Rebels over at redacted.inc. That's our private locals community where we can share exclusive content that we simply cannot share here on YouTube. Come over and join the rebellion together right now by going to redacted.inc. We'll see you next time.